at the same time. Okay. This panel, it's held in conjunction with the annual Matovsky Award ceremony, which will be held tomorrow at this time, and tickets are still available. We'd like to thank our sponsors, and here's a good view of them. And I'd also like to thank the members of our committee that put this together, and that includes from New York APOR, Patrick Hoey and Greg Hollick, and from the Roper Center Board, Liz Hamill, Limor Pierre, and Susan Pincus. Now, in terms of the way we'll be going today is we'll be hearing from the panelists, then there'll be a discussion among them for a bit, and then we'll include questions from you. And if you could put your questions in the chat, we'll be monitoring those, and our moderator will be selecting from what we've put together from that. And so that's how we're going to go. The moderator is Jennifer Gista, who is the Director of Polling and Election Analytics for CNN. So Jen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Murray. On this topic, it's not really news to say that race and attitudes about race have risen to a higher level of prominence in American politics in the last few years. Race and racial attitudes may well have played the decisive role in the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and his handling of those issues during his presidency led to a new and deeper fissures over the role race and racism play in American society. The tumult of 2020, with the unequal effects of the coronavirus pandemic plain to see, and a rising protest movement sparked partly by the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black Americans at the hands of police, brought the issues to the forefront in the middle of a heated presidential campaign. CNN polling last summer found that the share of Americans who said racism is a big problem in society today rose to nearly 2/3 in June, well above any level it had reached earlier, before subsiding by the end of the summer to 55%, still higher than in most any previous polling that we'd conducted. But the shifts were not uniform across party lines. By the end of the summer, the share of Democrats saying that racism was a big problem had dipped only slightly from 90% to 84%. Among independents, there was also a shallow decline from 63% to 57%. Among Republicans, though, the share calling it a big problem fell from 43% in June to 22% in late August. Network exit polling sponsored by CNN and other members of the National Election Pool also highlighted this partisan gap. Overall, 69% of voters called racism an important problem facing the country, with 68% who felt that way voting for Joe Biden. Among the 28% who said they considered racism a minor or not important problem, 84% backed Donald Trump. In our most recent polling, conducted just last week, only 5% say that racial injustice is the most important problem facing the country. That lags behind the economy and coronavirus. But that figure rises to 24%, about even with the economy and coronavirus among Black Americans. And the partisan divide on this is stark. While 9% of Democrats or Democratic-leaning independents say racial injustice is the most important issue, less than 1% of Republicans agree. The new typology report from the Pew Research Center out just today says that perhaps no issue is more divisive than racial injustice in the United States. Among the 4 Republican-oriented typology groups, no more than about a quarter say a lot more needs to be done to ensure equal rights for all Americans, regardless of their racial or ethnic background. And by comparison, no fewer than 3/4 of any Democratic group says a lot more needs to be done to achieve this goal. Even within those Democratic groups, the Pew survey finds divisions in the degree to which institutions and laws need to be changed in order to try to ensure equal rights, with majorities of the more liberal groups saying that they need a complete overhaul and others believing that change can happen within existing systems. Our panelists this afternoon will take us through some of the implications of these stark partisan and racial divides on this issue and on American politics. Our first presenter is Larry Bobo, Dean of Social Science and the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard University. Larry, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jen. Let me first thank Murray Edelman, for inviting me to be a participant in this very distinguished panel. Likewise, I would like to thank Murray again, as well as the Roper Center, New York APOR, and the other sponsors for convening us for this important discussion. As I only have a few minutes here to open things up, let me start by saying, for me, this will be a PowerPoint-free presentation. One of the boons or banes of being a dean is that you get less time to play with data that are at the heart of your own research. And so I find myself reading and synthesizing more than I do generating, collecting, and analyzing data, though I have a lot of material to draw on here. So turning quickly to a core element of the argument I will make this afternoon, which Jen's opening remarks have very much presaged. When asked to engage this question of public opinion, racism, and American democracy, the very first thing that occurs to me is to observe and insist, in fact, that matters of race and racism have always been among the central features of American democracy, legal institutions, political development, and culture. From the Constitutional Convention debates over whether or not to allow slavery, through the Civil War, the most deadly war in American history, to the development of Jim Crow institutions, laws, and practices, to the Civil Rights Movement, and now through the horrors of the Trump presidency and a stymied effort to enact something like a John Lewis Voting Rights Act, perceived racial difference and attended ideologies of racism, the stuff of much survey and public opinion research, have been central to the development of the American project. So at one level, this argument is inarguable, though as we know, the salience of race, the public open discourse about race, varies enormously over time. This is a sobering observation to make, and it's not my point here to begin on a downer or profound note of pessimism. The more immediate implication, I think, is that it is neither new nor unexpected that we are still wrestling with the racial divide in American social life and politics. Indeed, my core thesis is that it is in our failure to heal the racial divide that is at the center of the ways in which American democracy is now deeply troubled. The second immediate observation to make at a more practical and tangible level is that events of recent years, as Jen quickly sketched, make clear just how deep-rooted the race problem remains. Very quickly, the COVID-19 pandemic experience, something that sent each and every one of us into states of quarantine and a certain degree of fear for months, something that could and should have been experienced as a challenge faced by all those of a common irreducible humanity, showed to us instead just how racially unequal lived social experience remains in America. Those in certain occupations, store clerks, cashiers, bus drivers, meatpacking plant workers, etc. Those who lived in high density neighborhoods and housing developments. Those who could not work remotely. Those who had to rely on mass public transportation were, the pandemic rapidly and disproportionately revealed, to be people of color. In short, our segregated neighborhoods, our segregated job networks and occupations, our segregated literally standards of living were thrust back into general public view. The third and bottom line observation for me, and this is where I turn more directly to the role and importance of public opinion research, is that we now inhabit a moment of profound anxiety about the literal sustainability of American democracy and institutions. And as I say, I believe that has occurred because of a failure to heal the racial divide and the other shortcomings of contemporary politics that is attached to. The election of a candidate like Donald Trump was, I maintain, made possible because our political system, party system, and social policies, particularly at the national level, remain so deeply structured by race and racism that a grievously anti-democratic figure rose to the presidency. Let me quickly say that we know on the basis of a long stretch of survey research that enormous positive change in racial attitudes can take place. In the book, Racial Attitudes in America, that I co-authored with Howard Schuman, Charlotte Stee, and Maria Creason, we document a move in the United States on the basis of national survey data, first collected in the 1940s by NORC under the leadership of folks like Herbert Hyman and Paul Sheetsley, and ultimately Andrew Greeley and others, that in the early 1940s, most Americans, in this case, I mean most white Americans, comfortably endorsed the Jim Crow racial order. It was perfectly acceptable to be a segregated society. It was perfectly acceptable to have segregated schools. It was okay to openly discriminate in white preference for access to jobs and the like. In the ensuing years, in the post-World War II years, however, there was a sweeping move away from endorsing segregationist and Jim Crow outlooks, as public opinion data has documented, so strongly so that we ended up characterizing it in our book as a profound normative change with regard to race in the US. But that normative change had limits, so that in the modern period, I have come to talk about the development of a new regime of racism that I call laissez-faire racism, wherein the claims of African Americans and other minorities for redress and strong efforts to reduce race-related inequalities are rebuffed or challenged, in part through the emergence of a more qualified but nonetheless potent set of anti-minority racial stereotypes that are active, through a belief that the claims, demands, political agendas of minority communities are illegitimate and threatening or dangerous to the larger social order, and that indeed there really is no need for strong policies aimed at creating deeper or greater social justice, hence the controversies over affirmative action, and more recently, the emergence of immigration as a profoundly divisive and partisanship organizing issue. We often measure that specifically in surveys with a short scale called the racial resentment scale, propagated in many ways by political psychologists David Sears and Donald Pinder and their colleagues and students. My own work, and that actually of quite a few others, has shown that this is really a racial threat measure, a fear of status loss measure to potential racial minority agitators. And at the same time that segregationist sentiments were in decline, we've had astonishingly steady adherence to racial resentment points of views that say, for example, there's essentially not enough discrimination, the government's obligated to do anything. Minority demands are out of place and kind of un-American and anti-American and so on. What has changed, however, is the degree of connection between those sorts of racial outlooks and partisan identity, so that the connection between a sense of racial resentment and whether you identify as a Republican or Democrat has grown considerably stronger. And indeed, the connection between that sort of racial outlook and issue attitudes and literal voting has increased as well. And that is part of the new environment in which Donald Trump emerges. I want to kind of end on a note of why this is such a threat to our democracy. Why, and in part an answer to the question, how do we get such an anti-democratic candidate like Donald Trump? And I don't mean Democratic Party, I mean really democratic norms, institutions, and practices candidate like Trump, rising to become the standard bearer of one of our mainstream core political parties. And the answer to that lies in part in a set of ideas articulated by colleagues of mine here at Harvard, Steve Levitsky and Dan Ziblatt, who've written the book, How Democracies Die. And their core argument is that democracies don't fail primarily because of military coups or takeovers by generals and the like. They fail because of a rot from within. And that rot from within principally takes the form of a failure of political elites, especially of institutional party elites, to prevent the rise to legitimate elective office of powerfully anti-democratic politicians and their figures. Now, what are the criteria of an anti-democratic figure? An anti-democratic figure is one who implies you can't trust the electoral process and outcomes, and therefore, if I lose, it was stolen from me. Someone who literally demonizes their opponents they don't merely have different policy agendas and ideas, they're profoundly alienating folks who should be locked up. And you remember the slogan, lock her up, lock her up. Thirdly, they're quite ready to endorse a recourse to extreme behavior, including violence, to achieve their ends, like marching on the Capitol on January 6th or beating up members of an audience. And fourthly, deeply challenging other democratic institutions like the inquiry process and public disclosure process brought to us all by a free press. Trump is the only political candidate in American political history, according to these political scientists, who exhibited strong tendencies on all four criteria: not believing election outcomes, demonizing, not just debating with, but demonizing challengers, calling for openly for violent behavior, and threatening core democratic institutions. And how does he do that? My last point here will be that we've seen race matter enormously over the years in American politics, in a race-coded language, moving from law and order rhetoric and a Southern strategy of the Nixon era to Willie Horton of a later period in time, to John McCain's The Americans have been waiting for, to most recently with Trump, sadly, the kind of Mexicans are rapists, murderers, bringing drugs into our borders, the most openly bigoted beginning of a campaign, certainly I've seen in my lifetime, enough to have caused George Wallace to blush if he were still with us. That sort of appeal anchored Trump in a way with a certain non-trivial segment of, I think, the Republican Party base at this point, which opened the door for him to win. Now, it's got to be coupled with some other things, which I don't have the time to go through, like political stagnation, the rising inequality in America, growing ethnic diversity of the population. All of those things matter here in part of this tale. But if we want to make progress, and I think we can make progress, because the survey literature has shown it to be true, it was not a trivial thing to defeat Jim Crow ideology. And it was not a trivial social change that we have documented over the years in our work. Nor does racial resentment now remain static. As I say, the average level has declined only slightly recently, but its alignment with political identities and its political consequences have changed enormously. And that's something for us to focus on and work on providing an antidote to. And what is the antidote? In part, it is the existence of what I believe is survey data would sustain, is a majoritarian multiracial coalition that is far more progressive on race than it is regressive, if politicians are willing to appeal to it. The coalition that elected Barack Obama twice, which includes a substantial, though minority fraction of the white population, solid majorities of the Latino and Asian American population, and a super majority of the Black population, are enough to be a nationally controlling coalition if the politics is played rightly. So I'm very worried about the state of American democracy. I see racism as being very much at the heart of why we should all be worried about the fate and standing of our democracy. But if survey research teaches us one thing, it is that enormous change is possible, and we can't take any slice of data at one point in time and think that is our inevitable fate, however dreary a portrait it may paint. So I will stop there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Larry. Our next presenter is Mark Hugo Lopez with the Pew Research Center. He is the Director of Race and Ethnicity Research. Mark, all yours.
Great, thank you for the introduction. And Larry, really enjoyed your comments. I'm going to be a little bit focused on the Latino population and share with you some results that we've had for about Latinos in the United States, and particularly some of their views about race, which the census and many other sources have shown some very interesting findings recently, just even in the way Latinos describe their racial identity. So first, a little bit about who I am and where I'm from. The Pew Research Center is based in Washington, D.C. We are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. I just want to be clear about that because we endorse no policy and don't endorse any particular campaigns or candidates. And so I just want to be very clear about that in some of the things I'm going to talk about, and so the way I might answer some questions that come up a little later. But first, I want to share a finding from one of our surveys from earlier this year that asked the US public about whether or not increased public attention to the history of slavery and racism in America is good or bad, or perhaps neither good nor bad for US society. And you can see here that on net, about half of American adults said that it was good to have the increased public attention on the history of slavery and racism in America. About 26% that it was bad, and 21% said neither good nor bad. What I want to highlight here is some of the findings by race and ethnicity. And you can see the differences in responses on this question across different racial and ethnic groups. So for example, among Black Americans, 75% said it's good on net that the nation is increasing its attention, has increased public attention to the history of slavery and racism in the country. Also, you see that among Latinos and among Asian Americans, the majorities of those two groups also say the same, though both somewhat less than is the case for Black Americans. And among white Americans, 46% say it's very good or somewhat good that there's been increased attention to history of slavery and racism in the United States, that it's a good thing for US society to be having this increased attention. But also note the difference in terms of partisanship, that there is a partisan break here in terms of the views on this particular question. Just 25% of Americans who identify with or lean towards the Republican Party say that it's good for the US to have increased public attention to the history of racism and slavery in the United States. 46% say it's somewhat bad, or at least are very bad. So the net on bad, the on net numbers for bad are 46%. When you take a look at Democrats, you'll see that numbers are somewhat different. 78% say that on net it's good that there's a discussion about the history of racism and slavery in the country today, versus 9% who say that it's bad. So some very interesting findings, and I want to focus a little bit on the story of Latinos. Now, if you've been following the work of the Pew Research Center in the last week or so, as Jen mentioned, we just released today a really interesting and fascinating report on our political typology report, looking at partisanship in the country today. And there's also a nice quiz that you should take if you'd like to see where you sit compared to the general public in terms of your views about a number of important policy issues. But we also released a report last week looking at, within the nation's Hispanic population, what differences are there in terms of the importance of one element or one dimension of one's identity, that is one's skin color. Now, skin color and race are oftentimes tied together when we think about it in terms of studying these, but these are somewhat different concepts in some ways. So keep in mind that race does not necessarily equal skin color. But here in our work, we wanted to look within the United States to see if among Latinos, skin color matters in determining the outcomes of people's lives, if it affects their opportunities in life, if it also impacts their experiences with discrimination. So here first, you'll see that when we ask about whether or not skin color shapes daily life experiences, 57% of Latinos told us that happens a lot or some. So a majority say that skin color is shaping their daily experiences. But among Latinos, and this is one of the stories I would like for you to take away from my talk today, which is that there's diversity within the Hispanic population. Among Latinos, Latino Republicans are less likely to say this than Latino Democrats. So you'll see, for example, that only 40% of Latino Republicans will say that skin color shapes their daily life experiences a lot or some, but 68% of Latino Democrats say the same. Now, this is an interesting pattern because you'll see that within the Latino population, there's emerging over the course of the last decade or so, a number of differences, particularly along partisan lines. So when we talk about Latino voters have generally leaned very heavily towards the Democratic Party, but their support for Democratic candidates, whether at the presidential level or elsewhere, has varied depending on candidates, depending on elections, and Republican candidates have sometimes done better. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later when I talk to you about what we saw from the 2020 election. Now, of course, is skin color important in not only shaping people's daily life experiences, but what about in helping somebody get ahead in the country today? And how does that compare to other factors that might matter too? So we asked in our survey, we asked Latinos about whether or not having a lighter skin color helps or hurts somebody get ahead in the country today. What about having a darker skin color? And as you can see, the views among Latinos are that having a lighter skin color helps, whereas having a darker skin color is seen generally as hurting one's chances of getting ahead in the country today. What about a college degree? What about having legal status in the country? Well, these are two factors that actually are seen by Latinos as mattering more in helping somebody get ahead in the country today. And what about gender? 52% say that being a man helps somebody, Latinos, I'm sorry, get ahead in the country today, whereas 21% say that about being a woman. So there is also a difference in the views of the importance of gender in affecting Latinos' chances of getting ahead in the country today. But what about discrimination? Well, in the same survey, we asked Latinos a number of different questions about discrimination, and I want to share with you some of the findings by skin color, but also for the entire population of Latinos. First, we asked about 8 different incidents. This isn't exhaustive, but I think it's a good list to give you a sense of different types of things that might be happening. And you'll see that about 54% of Latinos tell us that they experienced at least one of these 8 things, with darker skinned Latinos more likely than lighter skinned Latinos to say so. And that's a pattern that you'll see all the way through. Darker skinned Latinos experience these incidents more than lighter skinned Latinos all the way throughout. But a couple of things here to keep in mind. Partly, when you take a look at, for example, experiencing discrimination by somebody who's not Hispanic, about 31% of Latinos told us that happened to them, with darker skinned Latinos more likely to say it than lighter skinned Latinos. But also 27% told us that they've experienced discrimination by someone who is Hispanic. So when you take a look at within the Hispanic population, there's also discrimination, also looks to be linked to skin color, happening within the population itself. And as I noted earlier, the nation's Hispanic population itself has a racial distribution, which is an important factor, I think, to keep in mind when talking about this very diverse population. And putting some numbers to this, how big is the nation's Latino population? Well, the census in 2020 counted 62.1 million Latinos. They've accounted for about half of the nation's population growth since 2010. Not the fastest growing group in percentage terms, but fastest growing in terms of just adding people. There's about 12 million more Latinos living in the country today than is the case, say, back in 2010. So very big and a very important part of affecting the nation's population story. But as Larry was saying, the nation's become more diverse, as has the nation's Hispanic population. If you look just naively at the racial distribution that's reported in the census, according to the latest 2020 numbers. And when you take a look at that, you'll see that today, only 20% of Latinos identify themselves as white. 33% say they're 2 or more races. 42% say there's some other race. And of course, you have about 2% or 1% saying they're Black or American Indian or American Native. But when you take a look at how that's changed since 2010, the share who say they're white has declined sharply from 53% then to 20% now. Now, this is an audience of survey researchers. And one of the things that immediately jumps out to me about this particular story is that the census did ask the race question differently, with a different question wording. It was also administered online for many folks, quote unquote, and more data was captured in open ends to be able to code data differently than, say, maybe it was the case in the past. So some of this may be due to the way the question was asked. But it's notable how diverse the nation's Hispanic population is when it comes to talking about racial identity. Those numbers also are quite striking. About 20.3 million Latinos tell us there are 2 or more races, with most being white and some other race as the combination. Now, all this, of course, might have implications for elections. And as you know, there's been a lot of focus on Latino voters recently. And what's interesting is that 2020 was the first election where Latinos potentially could have had more voters than Black Americans. So they were, at least in terms of eligible voters, the second largest group of voters by race or ethnicity. And when you look at how they voted, one of the things that's also striking is how the margin of victory for Democratic candidates, whether Clinton or whether Biden, has shifted. So back in 2016, according to our voter verified study, you'll see that Clinton won 66% of Latino voters' support compared to 28% for Trump, with a margin of about 38 percentage points. But in 2020, that number was down to a 21 percentage point margin, Biden over Trump. You can also see that across some different important subgroups of Latinos, men and women, college grads and those with some or less college, that some patterns that we see elsewhere in the electorate were also evident here. And so some very interesting patterns I think here to keep in mind. In fact, a key part of the story of 2020 is that Latinos in some parts of the country seem to have shifted towards Donald Trump in 2020 compared with 2016. South Florida, South Texas, and a few other places around the country. That's an interesting part of the story, but again, it points to the diversity of this population and how it is changing, and it's also diverse on a number of racial dimensions as well. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to our conversation. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to your questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions for any of the panelists, please be sure to put those in the chat so that we can make sure we ask those once we're finished with all of our presentations. Our final presentation today will be from Janelle Wong, Professor of American Studies and Asian American Studies at the University of Maryland. Janelle.
Thank you so much, Jen, and it's really a thrill to be here with this distinguished panel. I'm going to talk a little bit about Asian Americans, but also how Asian Americans, a focus on Asian Americans, can help us understand the broader racial landscape. So this has been quite a year for Asian Americans, particularly in the aftermath of Trump blaming the spread of the coronavirus on China and the spillover effects that had on Chinese Americans. And most of you are aware of the kind of rise in anti-Asian violence we saw in March of 2021. We saw a white shooter who attacked a spa in Atlanta. And also shortly after that, Sikh community members were attacked in Indianapolis. And there was a lot of attention to anti-Asian bias over the past year. And this played out in really, I think, interesting ways. We saw a mobilization effect, but it also triggered some conservatives to call on colleges and universities to overturn affirmative action, calling affirmative action, for instance, anti-Asian hate. So there was a kind of weaponizing of the rhetoric around Stop API Hate. And this was not just Republicans. We also saw prior to that moment where Republicans were focused on the anti-Asian hate, that far before that, Asian Americans had been, especially Chinese American immigrants, had been leading a kind of, or had been the public face of attacks on affirmative action, particularly at Harvard, but also in other institutions as well. And so you see this kind of tension where Asian Americans are the subject, the target of bias, and also where they are attacking civil rights programs, longstanding equity programs. And this started to also bring questions up to commentators. So my colleague Claire Kim was critical of the reaction by Congress to protect Asian Americans, in some ways saying, yes, of course, Asian Americans deserve protection, but what happened during that period when as hate crime laws were being passed at the federal level to protect Asian Americans, then we saw the energy to address police violence and Black Lives Matter really kind of waning in terms of policy. And this was the relationship that Asian Americans in particular have with Black Lives Matter was symbolized by the widespread sharing of photos that showed that an Asian American police officer was a witness and didn't stop the killing of George Floyd. And so this is, again, just the way in which Asian Americans are sort of figured in the larger racial landscape. And the question here is, how can public opinion help us to make sense of these sometimes contradictory dynamics? And I'm not going to talk about all this, but as many of you know, collecting public opinion data on Asian Americans, these are some of the projects that I've been involved in, is a kind of challenging task sometimes because of the diversity of the community, because of the multilingual nature of the population. And because it's still a very small population, we don't have access to probability-based frameworks often. So I'm going to do my best to share some of these data, but I wanted to also just center in on who are Asian Americans today. We've been talking about diversity, and I think it's really important to note that the Asian American community is a community in transformation. And so we see, even from 2000, that East Asians, who have long been the kind of dominant face of Asian America, are becoming a smaller proportion of the Asian American population. Today, Indians and Chinese, each of those groups, make up about 24% of the total Asian American population. And it's been a long time since East Asians were a majority of the Asian American population. That said, the community has become more diverse, but we've also seen, as the Asian American community has become more diverse in terms of national origin, we have seen a kind of consolidation around vote choice at the presidential level. And so since really 1996, we've seen that Asian Americans have been a group that has, until 2020, voted increasingly for the Democratic candidate. In 2020, as Mark mentioned, there was a little bit of a drop off for the Democratic candidate, and Asian Americans voted a little bit more for President Trump than in 2016. But you can see that despite this diversity, majorities of almost every Asian American group have support Biden over Trump. And why is that? I think is this group moving so fast towards the Democratic Party? One of the reasons that very few people talk about is that most Asian Americans prefer, including the most Republican-leaning group, Vietnamese Americans, prefer a bigger government with more services to a smaller government with fewer services. And those of you who study, which are most of us, public opinion, know that this is actually a racial divide. This is something that divides whites from non-whites, and it's something that we see across the Asian American community. There's also, I think, something that's often missed in analyses of Asian Americans is that Asian Americans are healthcare voters. So you can see across the board, Asian Americans very strong, among the strongest supporters of universal healthcare, Obamacare. They also are environmental voters. So these are things that are not often connected to the Asian American community, but I think are important to note, and why Asian Americans have trended Democrats over the past 2 decades. They are environmentalists. They also are very strong supporters of gun control. So these are some of the issues that have drawn Asian Americans to the Democratic Party. This might come as a surprise, given the slide I showed earlier, but throughout this really contentious period over affirmative action, as Professor Bobo mentioned, we actually see Asian Americans, at least in terms of surveys, saying that a majority support affirmative action. And this is race-conscious admissions that we ask about. The one group that has been more tepid over time has been Chinese Americans, my own group. And we can see that there's much more fluctuation and lower levels of support among Chinese. And that is really who you see on the ground mobilizing against affirmative action. But I think it's also important to note that the majority of Asian Americans have supported affirmative action throughout the last decade. When it comes to Black Lives Matter, as I mentioned before, this might also be new data for you. And I've seen several surveys that show these kind of similar patterns, which is that a majority of Asian Americans do support, are favorable towards Black Lives Matter, but there is a lot of age variation. And there are a lot of higher numbers of Asian Americans say they don't know or haven't heard of the movement. And so you can see that kind of pattern here. And we've also asked about some of these other pressing issues that others have raised today, which is, how do people feel about moving funding for law enforcement into other community priorities like education or mental health? And you can see here, these are registered voters, that Asian Americans on the whole are fairly supportive of this kind of reallocation, much more supportive. So this is a survey that was conducted around the same time, and much more supportive than the general population. I wanted to just share a few more slides from another survey that I did right after. This is with SurveyMonkey, and this survey was conducted 2 days after the shootings in Atlanta of the Asian American women and others who were in those spas in Atlanta. And one of the things to note here is that this survey was conducted only in English. But I just wanted to say this was a survey about discrimination, and we have found in all of our past work that those who take a survey in English and those who are US born are actually more, not less likely than the foreign born to report experiences with discrimination. And so these results are probably more of an overestimate than underestimate of experiences with discrimination. So let's look at hate crimes and hate incidents. And we asked people, have you ever been a victim of a hate crime? And we had some standard language that we used in the past, and you can see it here. And over this period, what we see is that, and it shouldn't come as a surprise, Black Americans are the group that is most likely to report, to say that they've been a victim of a hate crime in surveys. And Asian Americans and Latinx, all groups experience a fairly high proportion of racialized violence. There was some convergence in our surveys. About 10% of people of color were reporting hate crimes or hate incidents. And, I think something that sometimes got lost in the coverage of anti-Asian bias, which of course did increase over the pandemic year, is that Black Americans continue to face the highest levels of racialized violence by many measures. So in California, over the pandemic year, we saw that Black Californians reported 5 times the number of hate crimes as Asian Americans in California, even though they are less than half the population size of Asian Americans. And so this was something that I think fewer people noticed because there was a lot of attention, rightly so, obviously, to Asian Americans, but I think there was also a disappointing lack of attention to the kind of racialized violence that other groups were also facing. And that is not just a function of reporting. So we can see here that there are similar levels of lack of confidence in the criminal justice system if reporting is done. And so you can see Black Americans and Asian Americans both do not feel that justice will be served. And one of the last things I'll say on this point is that a lot of the headlines, at least in my communities, were focused on elderly Asian Americans who were being violently attacked, really horrific kinds of violence. But if we look at public opinion data, what we see is that Asian Americans are more likely, Asian American men are more likely to say that they have been a victim than Asian American women. That was quite different than what was being reported based on hotlines, and that elders were not being disproportionately targeted. And it's worth, I think, also noting that most incidents were verbal harassment and shunning, not physical violence. Of course, any bias incident is one too many, but I think public opinion data can also kind of help add more context to these headlines. And I'll end on this, that these surveys have really shown us these distinct forms of racism in our community. So if we look at that SurveyMonkey AAPI data survey, we can see that, for instance, Asian Americans are subject to a kind of perpetual foreigner stereotype. So that when people were asked, have you ever been encouraged to Americanize or whiten your name? You can see that Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders are the group most likely to say that this has been their experience. Or have they been asked, where are you from? Assuming they're not from the US, you can see, again, this is a kind of unique but not exclusive Asian American experience, with 64% of Asian Americans saying that they have experienced people asking them where they're from. But when asked about this other kind of microaggression, have people acted as if they are afraid of you? And recall, this is conducted during the pandemic. We see that Black Americans are more likely to say that people acted as if they are afraid of them than Asian Americans, 45% versus 18%. And this survey also captured these other distinct forms of racism that I think are important to acknowledge. Have you ever been, and this is no surprise, but it's still worth underscoring, have you ever been unfairly stopped, searched, questioned? Have you ever experienced police misconduct, basically? We see Black Americans, of course, the most likely. Asian Americans actually among the least likely to experience this kind of institutionalized violence. And of course, we also did look at subgroups within the Asian American community, and surprisingly, the patterns were pretty similar. Have you ever been prevented from moving into a neighborhood? So housing discrimination, again, Asian Americans were least likely to experience this kind of, among people of color, this kind of institutionalized discrimination. Black Americans much more likely to. So I'll end with this, that, racism does affect all communities of color, but in really distinct ways that public opinion does help make clear. And there are critical implications for democracy here. And I'll end with this last slide, which is from a survey I've conducted with colleagues at UCLA and the University of Arizona. When we ask about attacks on the US Capitol that Larry mentioned on January 6th, was it a protest that went too far or a coordinated insurrection? We see that the responses are somewhat racialized. You can see that white Americans are more likely to say it was a protest that went too far. But I'll leave you with this kind of slide to think about what the other results for people of color mean in terms of who's protecting democracy and where we kind of stand regardless of racial background. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janelle. I want to thank all of our presenters for wonderful presentations to kick us off. And we're going to move on to discussion. If you do have any questions, as a reminder, please make sure to put those in the chat. Before we get to questions from the audience, I would like to give the panelists a chance to respond to the other presentations if they would like to do so, or if they have any questions for the other members of the panel. Go for it. Now's your chance. Not hearing any. Okay. So I have one question that I'll kick us off with for Larry. You talked about how racial resentment has grown increasingly connected to partisanship over time, and that sort of environment led to the emergence of Donald Trump. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how much Donald Trump's behavior may have normalized those behaviors, and does it accelerate the process of those connections, or was it sort of already on the path and it was going that way sort of regardless of his actions during his time in office? Oh, did we lose Larry?
No, well, you did for a moment, so I missed the first part of your question, if there was a question there.
Yes, I was asking when you talked about the connection between racial resentment and partisanship and how closely tied they are, how much of that connection is sort of driven by the normalization of those attitudes by a candidate like a Donald Trump, whereas you had said those conditions sort of allowed the emergence of that kind of a candidate, sort of chicken and egg-ish.
Yeah, so it's not just Trump, but Trump capitalized on it and accelerated it, I think. So unfortunately, as we know, there's both parties are implicated in the racialization of our politics. So I don't want to see this as a purely partisan issue. Democrats have largely taken for granted that minority voters, especially African Americans, are where they have to go, that they're captured in effect by that party, and that therefore we needn't take their particular concerns and claims with special prominence and emphasis, but because they don't have an alternative. Republicans, on the other hand, especially as the population and the electorate has diversified and the white vote has become a smaller fraction of the population, they have increasingly relied upon the race card as a strategy to victory, but they've done it subtly. And that's one sign of the importance of that normative transformation I mentioned. So they haven't gone straight with openly bigoted rhetoric, but it's been appeals to law and order. It has been the manipulation of a kind of states' rights rhetoric in different eras. It's been an attack on welfare, stereotypes, so that there's a subtle mobilization of an underlying racial bias. That has become so routinized, however, and actually from my point of view, I think gone without sufficient response and challenge from Democrats, except in rare circumstances, say when Jesse Jackson denounced the Willie Horton ads as openly racist. And we have pretty good data that did a lot to kind of break the power of that ad and to force people to back away from it in that era. But I'll pose your question one final way and then let others speak to this or wherever you want to go. How does Donald Trump become the Republican nominee, given that, remember, there were 16 viable Republican candidates when he stepped on the stage, having never held an elective office, having never run for an elective office. Several of those candidates, at least 3 of them, had enormous fundraising potential, resources, and bankable names like Bush in the Republican Party. And he vanquished them. He vanquished them in fairly short order. How is that possible? And I think he just put his finger right on that racial button. And he did it in part by incorporating in that dangerous minority group Mexican Americans and racializing them in the opening of his campaign. And that sadly increased the relevance, I think, of racialized thinking to partisanship and the voting process. But so it's not static. This is part of what I want to convey. It really does interact with political entrepreneurship and other contextual circumstances.
Thank you. I have one question for Mark. We were asked, when surveying Latino populations, are there discernible differences based on national origin? I feel certain you can address that one.
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, there are discernible differences based on national origin. Sometimes, though, it is hard to get sufficient sample sizes of national origin groups to be able to tell their stories. But as the questioner notes, he says, what about Cubans? What about Puerto Ricans? What about Mexicans, for example? You'll see that Mexican Americans tend to lean more towards the Democratic Party, and Puerto Ricans even more so than Mexican Americans. But you'll find that Cubans have generally leaned towards the Republican Party more so than other origin groups of Hispanics. This last election in 2020, though, also shows that it's a story of not only Cuban Americans in a place like South Florida in terms of strong support for, say, Donald Trump in 2020, but just generally identifying with or leaning towards the Republican Party. You also see that, for example, emerging among Venezuelans. So it's a story that's emerging among Venezuelan Americans. And in South Florida, generally, Latinos in South Florida who are not all Cuban and not all Venezuelan, but also include Dominicans, Nicaraguans, Colombians, tend to lean more towards the Republican Party. But there are other dimensions that matter for the Latino voters. So another one of the comments and questions here was that Latinos are not a monolithic group. Be cautious on your results. Eric, that's a really great point. Latinos are not a monolithic group, and the dimensions of diversity are not only about origins, but also around gender, around age, but also immigrant generation and location in the country. There's so much to the diversity of the Latino population that to even call it the Latino vote is perhaps not the best way to describe it, but instead it's a group of Latino voters is perhaps captures that potential diversity better.
Thank you, Mark. Janelle, a question came in asking, to what extent does self-reported hate based on religion inform the racist numbers, which I think was about your slide on people who have experienced hate crimes. And I don't know if you have any data. I mean, breaking your very small groups into even smaller groups, but if there's
we've seen some interesting trends, and it is a good question. So in the past, up until 2020, we did see that the group that was most likely to report hate or racial bias incidents were South Asians, especially Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, those, I saw another question that was asking about that. And that was really a function of the wave of hate crimes that were directed at Muslims and South Asians after 9/11. And that continued to sort of come in waves throughout the last 2 decades. And this was really the first year in 2020 where I saw that East Asians, that is Koreans, Chinese, Japanese, were reporting higher levels of incidents than South Asians. That doesn't mean that South Asian Americans weren't affected and weren't experiencing hate crimes. That's something that I've tried to underscore here. All groups of color were experiencing a lot of racialized hate. But part of the motivation, it is very, very hard to measure the motivation. Like, people report what they think, and what we ask them is, do you think that this experience with discrimination was based on, and then we ask them your accent, and they can choose multiple: your accent, your skin color, your race, your national origin, or your religion. And so that is something that can be parsed out for purposes here. It is actually hard for people to parse it out themselves.
Thank you. Cheryl Arnett asks us, the polling community could be delving much deeper into these issues. Would love your thoughts on the circumscribed way many race-related questions are asked. Mark's intro question, are you good, bad, on increased public attention to the history of slavery and racism? This removes whites, the creators and perpetrators of these ills, from the equation. Similarly, Larry's reference to the trend question, quote, a lot more needs to be done to address racism. The question really is, when will whites stop obstructing racial equality? Do you think these constructs give us a false sense of progress? And whoever would like to take that one, go for it.
Can I quickly say, no, I don't think they give us a false sense of progress, as long as we as researchers remain grounded and are thinking carefully about how situations are evolving. So the sort of questions that we use to tap racial resentment really grew out of efforts to grasp what was going on in response to the urban riots and Black Power protests of the mid to late 60s, when the kind of pre-civil rights legislation issues of segregation, open discrimination had seemingly been defeated by federal legislation and court rulings. And lo and behold, yes, a new way of expressing animosity emerged, which I think, and I think most people would probably agree, is more porous and pliable than what existed before. I mean, Jim Crow absolute bias is a different world from qualified stereotypes that are sometimes but not always acted on. I mean, so things do undergo real change here. I think survey researchers have wrestled with it. What we have to be careful with, and I'll stop here, is drawing too powerful a set of inferences. Early analysts looked at the decline in segregation and talked about an end to racism. That's not what happened. We shifted to a slightly different character of racism, not to the end of racism as a challenge or problem. So you got to be careful what the inference made is.
Great. Mark or Janelle, anything you'd add there?
I mean, I think what we're confronting here, there's, we are dealing with data, and everyone here is really interested in data. And this conversation is making me think, okay, so what is the purpose? What are we unearthing here? Yes, we can identify racial resentment. We can see that it has been both changing, and also it has been it's not going away. But I think survey research has also shown us that people don't care that much about data, and that's not what is creating. It's really the narrative that I think has really been creating these divides, that has really been allowing racism to flourish. And it's a question that I think comes up for me. I think about, I spent all this time collecting these data, but nobody really cares anymore, at least in the voting public. Like, that's not what's driving them. You can tell them a lot of facts about data on immigrants. We can show them all that Pew data on the declining numbers of undocumented immigrants and declining numbers of Mexican immigrants, and you still see people wanting to build a wall, right? And so I think this is a moment for us to really think about what do we do with these data, and how can we, to the question of the panel, like how do we address racism with these data when data is becoming increasingly irrelevant to people's thinking about, I don't know if it's increasingly, but it seems like they're not paying much attention to data these days.
Although I think you're right. If facts, evidence, it's always hard to get them into a real policy discussion, right? It's like you don't want to watch the sausage being made because it's not a dispassionate, data-driven exercise. It's really a sloppy, messy, this works for my people and me and get me reelected kind of horse trading sort of thing. But I think the data can influence elites and what they do. And now I'll make a really dramatic statement. I think it was clear to many political insiders in 2016 that in order to have a majoritarian Democratic ticket, at that point in time, given the makeup of the likely electorate, Hillary Clinton needed a Black running mate. She didn't choose one. Joe Biden did not make that mistake. Okay, and it's like, this is your coalition. These are the people you got to get hyper turnout from. This is what you got to act on. And the idea that you were going to construct a different coalition and win, in hindsight, I think was very naive. There are a lot of other complexities there, but I think data matters for making a lot of judgments. It doesn't necessarily move the mass opinion. For example, I would say, if Martin Luther King had been driven by polling data, we'd have never had a bus boycott. We'd have never had the Civil Rights Act in 1960. I mean, that's not what produced these things. But data is irrelevant, quite relevant to what you say, our narratives, our understanding about what matters. And so I think contributing to informing, enriching those narratives is what we have to do.
While we're on the topic of narratives, one of the questions we got was about the Democrats, pundits and media party strategists following Virginia and New Jersey, suggesting that the lesson for Democrats is that they've conceded too much to the progressive wing, focused too much on CRT, police reform, structural racism. Is this an example of what, Larry, you would call laissez-faire racism, or not so much?
I think it's a very powerful example of laissez-faire racism. And to pick up Patrick's question and Michael's premise as well, it's not easy for Democrats to respond to these things because it does risk pouring gasoline on the fire. And you can see the dilemma politicians who really desperately need the Black vote but are trying to make a complicated argument have. All right, so that if a Democratic politician comes out and goes, I'm against critical race theory too in the schools, my God, how many Black votes does he lose by putting that idea on the table? So my big concern is that I think by not having a well-articulated position, it lets your opponent define you. Because none of the Democrats were campaigning for critical race theory in school. I mean, no one was advancing that. It was something Republicans projected onto Democratic candidates and to which they largely remained mute, right? They didn't respond in an effective way. So that what I say is candidates need to work with the Obama triangulation strategy. And what is that? You want to acknowledge the majority white concern or grievance here about radical, stigmatizing, guilt-inducing ideas getting into the schools. You want to acknowledge the complaint from minority communities about why it's important to really tell the history of slavery, to tell the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentleman's Agreement, to tell the history of stripping land away from Mexican Americans and the horror stories now taking place on our border. We want to be true about that, but that doesn't mean you can't hear that first voice. And then the last thread is to still stress ultimately e pluribus unum, right? So you got to do 1, 2, 3. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. People got to do all of those things, which Obama always did. He really exemplified that. Few other candidates are able to pull it off so deftly.
Thank you. Janelle, we got a clarification on the question I asked you earlier about the interaction of religion with racist incidents, and that was about white Americans reporting racial hate. My hypothesis on that went to those who perceived hate based on whiteness and being a Jew or a Muslim, for example. Would you like to address that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to see when some measurement issues when we're asking about discrimination, and whites are reporting quite a high degree of discrimination. That was true in my survey, but also we've seen it elsewhere where there are lots of surveys now that show that certain groups of whites, particularly if you look at break the sample out by party, where white Republicans think that they, like whites, are facing more discrimination than blacks today, right? And that has changed. I mean, I've seen that change over the last, I would say, even 5 years. It's gotten a little bit more intense, and the meaning of that discrimination, I think, is different for people of color versus whites. And so I think this is something that, okay, I will concede data does matter, that it's interesting to trace, and it's really important force in US politics and thinking about race, is this idea that whites are the most discriminated group in the US now is super powerful, and something that I think we are picking up in these surveys.
Yep. Now, I would say, just a quick footnote to that. Back in the 1990, I guess, General Social Survey, my goodness, I'm getting old. We had a question on affirmative action, and we also asked the general policy question, whether you favored or opposed, but then we also asked people if they thought affirmative action would cost whites access to jobs. And about a very high percentage, 2/3 or more of the white respondents in this national sample said, yes, it would. But we had a follow-up question that said, basically, why do you feel that way? Is it because of a personal experience, something you've directly observed, or something you've heard about in the media? The overwhelming response was, I heard about it in the media. It was not about a direct personal experience.
Keying off that, there's a question here about social media, and that can be used to move opinions about things like how the economy is performing and relative financial position. Does any of this research show how attitudes about race can be meaningfully shifted?
Mark? No, it's a hard.
It's a hard question to answer.
It's a hard question to answer.
I would say, though, that events that happen do focus the public's attention on race in different ways. So look at what's happened in the last few years. And if you look at, just for example, support for Black Lives Matter across the last 2 years or so, there was a surge in support during the summer of 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. And we've more recently seen a decline among everybody except Black Americans, but other groups kind of returning back to where they were before, which does suggest to me that at the very least, attention to an issue, whether or not that's misinformation through social media or just a lot of social media attention, whether that's the way the news media portrays something. But no matter what happens, a focus on events and the national attention can lead to perhaps some shifts in opinions about some things related to race and race relations. How strong that is, I don't know. What it all means, I don't know. I think there's a lot more that I'd like to do to explore this, because it's a really great question. But at the very least, we do see some shifts in public opinion attitudes as events unfurl across the country.
I'll give a little bit of hope to people that, so I have a colleague, Dana Fisher, who studies social movements, and she was really surveying particularly subsamples like those who attended the Women's March, for instance. And she definitely found over time that their priorities changed from like gun control and the environment to Black Lives Matter. And so that was really among white women, right? And she also found that white women make up the vast majority of those who are participating in Indivisible, older white women. And so, you know, that's kind of another angle on that racial coalition that Larry is talking about. But I think a number of graduate students I know, and probably some of those who are on this call, have been looking at prejudice reduction through you know, stories, vignettes, and especially those kinds of stories and vignettes that put people into the position of another, and find kind of, I mean, at least the students' work I'm thinking about actually does have some sort of significant effect. I don't know, you know, what's an open question is like, how long does it last? How context specific is it? It's hard to measure that kind of change in this short period of a year or 2 years through survey research. But I think, you know, the kind of work that Larry and his colleagues did to really look over a long period of time, we can see maybe some of those changes. But I think there is research on like what can be done, and social media then can be that outlet for those narratives, right? Those scenarios.
Yeah, I think we can affect the kind of cultural landscape, the kind of ideas that are taken seriously. That's what we can aspire. So, for example, this is not so much survey data, but a form of empirical data collection. One of the attitudes that underwent the earliest change in our look at trends in racial attitudes was about at least willingness to express the idea, say that African Americans were inherently inferior to whites, inherently less intelligent. That changed very early on, kind of falling into disrepute. I mean, I have to believe, we don't have much direct data on it, but I have to believe some of that is tied to the enormous change that took place certainly in institutions of higher education and elite circles, when you're getting, you know, IQ test data, especially as you know, virtually the entire male population is being tested for potential military service in the 40s and so on, and you find that, you know, urban Blacks test much higher than most Southern whites, right? And you got to go, huh, interesting. There seems to be social causation embedded in some of this, and it starts to alter the narrative about these sorts of events, and some claims just become less credible, which is not to say that biological racism has completely disappeared. It hasn't, but kind of comfortable articulation and advocacy of that point of view underwent really a profound transformation that by and large, I think, endures, even if there's some underlying recourse to, you know, essentialist thinking that still gets articulated, but it's in a much more qualified, uncertain way than it would have been in 1930 or 1940, and that's consequential. That's a meaningful transformation. And now, for example, we can hope, I don't know that it's true, Mark was pointing to some data that makes me worry, that the emphasis on the degree of inequality brought to light by the COVID-19 era, and the police brutality and the death of George Floyd and this whole period of reckoning, I think have kind of altered the landscape with regard to police brutality issues. Now, unfortunately, creation of politically effective coalitions to create reform is still a challenge. But I think the cultural landscape there has moved in an important way.
Thank you. I have a question for Janelle from Murray. Could you talk a little bit about why some Asian groups are more Democratic leaning while others, such as the Vietnamese, are slightly more Republican?
Yeah. First, also, let me just mention that the student whose work I would mention, Alana Safarpour, is actually on this call and can drop the resources into the chat, and is now a postdoc at Harvard. So Alana has been doing that work on prejudice reduction that I just mentioned. But I also will just say that Vietnamese have been leaning more Republican than other Asian American groups, primarily because of anti-communist attitudes. So it's really related to foreign policy. And this was actually stoked during the insurrection. So there were fears that went around. This is very similar, I think, Mark, to what you saw in Florida among Cubans, that the kind of they associate strong anti-communist stances with the Republican Party. And there was a lot of misinformation via ethnic social media that really connected the Democratic Party to communist ideologies. And so there were not just Vietnamese flags, but other Asian flags on January 6th at the Capitol. I just read a story. This is certainly not true of all Vietnamese. Vietnamese were actually moving slightly to, like, over generation to the left. But there have been these kind of newsworthy stories recently where I just read one where Vietnamese Americans whose last name was Tran actually changed their name to Trump because of the past 4 years. And so I think there's movement in both directions. We also see in Orange County, which has been a very strong Vietnamese enclave, that Vietnamese are partly why Orange County in California has been trending more blue. So this is not everyone, but compared to other Asian Americans, yes, Vietnamese are more tend to be more Republican.
Thank you. Mark, I have a question on a data point that you touched on. You noted that the growing share of Latinos, or I think you said Latinos, are identifying as multiracial now, or shifting their racial identity. There's also, from the early release census data, clearly an indication that there's a growing share of people who are identifying as multiracial overall. What are your thoughts on the implication of that shift on the future of politics and issues like the racism and racial issues that we have been discussing today?
It's a really great question, but I would caution again that some of the census results, that extra 18 million or so Latinos who say that they're two or more races, some of that may be coming from the change in the question better capturing information in an open end, like 50 characters versus 10, and also that the coding scheme of the Census Bureau may be coding some people in a way that they don't necessarily see themselves as multiracial, but because of the coding scheme of the Census Bureau, they got classified as such. The reason why I bring this up is because in other surveys, including surveys we've done at the Pew Research Center, when we ask a Census Bureau style question in the last year or so, we get about half of Latinos identifying as white, very similar to the 2010 results of the census. So there's something there that one needs to be very cautious about. Even so, we are seeing intermarriage rates among Latinos continuing to rise. So about 30%, for example, of Hispanic newlyweds marry somebody who's non-Hispanic. That's up from what it was in the 1980s, but it was also quite high in the 1980s, about 27%. So it's been pretty steady over this period, and that's through 2019. Among the US born, that number rises to 39% among US born Hispanic newlyweds. Why does this matter? Well, the implications are, what does it mean for the children of parents who are Hispanic and a non-Hispanic spouse together? Does that mean that perhaps the identity of those children might be something different into the future? I don't know. I think it remains to be seen what will happen, but we do see the farther that Latinos get from their immigrant roots, the more likely they are to call themselves American most often, as opposed to by their country of origin term. But there isn't necessarily a pattern to politics. So we don't necessarily see it across the generations, Latinos becoming less Democrat or more Republican, or the other way around. It really does seem to be a much more complicated story that's tied to origin countries, that's tied to immigrant generation, but it's also tied to the circumstances of the places where people live, because the population is so big and dispersed across the country. But it remains to be seen sort of where we might go. In fact, what even Hispanic identity might be in the future with intermarriage rates as high as they have been. And on top of that, that immigration from Latin America has slowed. Well, maybe in the last year or so that's changed, but it's slowed over the course of a decade. So that means that things could look different in 20 or 30 years than they do now.
Thank you. We just have a few more minutes left before we are out of time here. So you all have a captive audience of survey researchers, and I would love to know what your thoughts are for what survey researchers should know when they are considering doing research on these topics, and what would you maybe most like to see from the survey research that's out there on these topics. Anybody want to start? or should I fulfill my moderator role? I will call on Janelle. You can start.
So, I think so much of this, it sounds so boring, but so much of it comes down to sampling, and it is becoming so challenging to sample, especially when we're looking at these hard to reach groups. And so I think all of us need to come and meet this moment and think hard about the kind of questions that we can now answer. Given, I'll tell you a story that one of the last, and I'm sure you're all experiencing this too, one of the last surveys I did, we basically had a really hard time collecting, and I know this is true for other groups, collecting data, enough sample on white Republicans. We had to, and it's a challenge. So we had to actually terminate on white Democrats and then start to collect. And so that adds this starts to create some other problems with our sample. And so just thinking, I know we're all thinking about it. Like, this is not a very easy time to collect survey data. And then when you're talking about asking people questions about race and you're calling from like a big organization or a university, who's answering the phone and what are people saying? These are things like that. These questions definitely keep me awake at night. And I hope we can work together to address some of these potential limitations.
Great, thank you. Mark, your thoughts?
This is I think there's a couple of elements to the challenge that I see. Partly it's about, as Janelle just said, sampling. Part of that is also being sure that we have enough of particular groups to be able to tell their story within a national survey of the US public. I would also say that when thinking about these surveys, that we also think about presenting the data about racial and ethnic groups in rich ways. And what I mean by that is, if we're going to have a data point for Hispanics, that we're hopefully the sample is large enough to be able to say, here's what Latino Democrats say, here's what Latino Republicans say, here's what Latino men, Latinas, here's what they say. In other words, be able to have enough of a sample size for Hispanics to be able to tell the story of Hispanics, because as we've been saying, it is a diverse group and it's not a monolithic group. The same is true for Black Americans. There's a rich story there as well. Differences by age, differences by gender, differences by place in the country, and also there's a growing foreign-born population of people who identify as Black. How can we tell those diverse stories as well? So when talking about these groups, I see the opportunity for us to be richer in the way we tell their stories, because we tell the stories for white Americans in many ways. We talk about college-educated whites, we talk about white Republicans and white Democrats. We should be doing the same for these other groups if we can. The second thing that I would say that I hope is a part of the story when we're thinking about these groups is we oftentimes classify these groups in mutually exclusive ways. White non-Hispanics, Asian non-Hispanics, Black non-Hispanics, all single race groups, mixed race people, and then Hispanics, for example. But the public, I'm not so sure, thinks about itself that way. So despite my cautions about the 2020 census showed the nation is thinking about itself in many different ways. People see themselves as a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and they want to claim those identities. That's part of who they are. So we should be thinking about, as pollsters, ways that we can think about talking about overlapping identities. So people who identify as Black and who identify as white, is that a unique story that maybe we need to explore? So doing something that's so mutually exclusive as groups may be missing some opportunities to explore important stories within the US public. And I hope that we as a field can start thinking about different ways to report out racial identities. Those would be my two messages.
Thank you, Mark. Larry?
Yeah, I would say here to both the suggestions that Janelle and Mark made. I think for me in the kind of racial attitude domain, it's just so vitally important to recall that attitudes are complex and multidimensional. The idea that there's a single prejudice to tolerance, racist to non-racist dimension is just too simple a framework to bring to these things. As we've all said, the internal complexity of these populations is something that has to be taken with enormous seriousness, because you get results that you may not see coming, like the 20% of African American men who voted for Donald Trump, which ought to raise a lot of questions about what's going on out there. And the other point I made earlier about inferential judgment. I mean, I think we often get a 1-point slice in time reading on a controversial issue, and we infer too much on the basis of a response to one or a small number of questions at a single point in time. So we need to have inferential judgment. And then to go back to finally to the point Mark was making about being in a position to tell richer stories. I am very, very fond of, and it's always influenced my thinking, Paul Lazarsfeld's 1950 APOR presidential address, where he called for pollsters to be good servants of history. So the title of the talk was, "What does the 1950 pollster owe the 1984 historian?" And we need to do really ambitious, deep, complicated, sophisticated job of characterizing what's happening in our times, recognizing that there's going to be dynamism and fluidity, but bringing some sophistication to thinking about what the sources and conditions around that dynamism and fluidity are likely to be. So that's what I would stress.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your time with us today. This was a wonderful discussion, and I'm going to kick it back over to Murray.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for holding this discussion with really good questions. Thank you so much, and especially to the panelists for all of your contributions. And I want to point out that if this has inspired you, that tomorrow you'll get a chance to attend an award ceremony for Larry Bobo, Dean Bobo, who you've just heard. And that's at 4 o'clock Eastern. And tickets are available. Someone will hopefully put them in the chat in a moment. And it'll be very easy for you to come. And that's on Zoom. And New York APOR, this will take a second, I hope. Hello. Don't you just love this? Okay, New York APOR has some programs lined up. There's just a second. I can do this. I can do this. There we go. Anyway, they have some on November is Hot Promoter Scores. December 15th is a webinar on B2B research. And on January 25th, there's a book discussion with Susan Herbst. And you can find all this at newyorkapor.org/events. So I want to, again, thank everyone for coming and have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Great.
Thank you.